Kelvin was a man who had risen from the ashes of extreme poverty to become a billionaire in the oil and gas industry. He lived in a grand mansion with his wife, Ngozi Chukwu, a stunningly beautiful woman who had a heart as kind as her face was fair. Kelvin's sisters, Amara and Grace, were equally successful in their respective fields. Amara, married to a wealthy businessman, owned a luxurious boutique and a thriving clothing line that catered to the elite. Grace, single and fiercely independent, ran one of the most successful gold jewelry companies in the country. From the outside, the family was a picture of wealth and success. Yet a strange and inexplicable mystery haunted them. Their mother, Amaka, refused to partake in their wealth. Instead, she spent her days sitting on the street corners, begging for alms. She dressed in tattered clothes, her face marked with the wrinkles of hardship, refusing to visit her children or accept their money. The family's story had started in a local bacha in a slum. Amaka, a widow, had struggled to raise her 3 children after her husband succumbed to high blood pressure, a victim of poverty's relentless grip. They lived a life of unimaginable hardship, hawking sachets of pure water and plantain chips on the streets to survive. Their daily meals consisted of soaked gari, eaten morning, noon, and night. Nights were often filled with tears as Amaka cried into her pillow, praying for a miracle. Their plight worsened with time, and Kelvin, being the eldest, felt the crushing weight of responsibility. He tried his best to support his family, but every effort seemed futile. One fateful day, Amaka left the house at dawn and returned later in the afternoon with an unusual glow of hope on her face. She called her children together, her voice trembling with emotion. "God has answered our prayers," she said, handing Kelvin a bundle of money wrapped in an old cloth. "Take this money, my son. Go to the city and invest it wisely. It's all we have. Use it to change our story." Kelvin was bewildered. He asked where the money had come from, but Amaka brushed off his questions, urging him to focus on building a future for the family. Kelvin took the money and left for the city. He worked tirelessly, investing in a small oil trading business that soon grew exponentially. His hard work and determination paid off, and within a few years, he became a powerful figure in the oil and gas industry. His newfound wealth brought opportunities for his sisters as well. Kelvin funded Amara's dream of owning a boutique and clothing line, while Grace used her share of the wealth to establish her gold jewelry empire. The siblings transformed their lives completely. They moved their mother into a luxurious mansion, but to their shock, Amaka refused to stay. She insisted on returning to the streets, where she continued to beg. No amount of persuasion or lavish gifts could change her mind. Now, years later, Kelvin often found himself staring out of the massive windows of his mansion, questioning his mother's decision. He had built a life of luxury for her, yet she chose to sit on the dusty streets, stretching out her hand for alms. One day, Kelvin decided to confront her. He dressed simply to avoid attracting attention and drove to the street corner where she usually sat. Amaka was there, her frail frame hunched over, her hand outstretched as passers-by dropped coins into her tin can. "Mother," Kelvin said, kneeling beside her, "why do you do this? We have everything now. I've built us a life of comfort. Why won't you come home?" Amaka looked at her son with eyes that held a mix of sorrow and wisdom. She reached out and touched his cheek. Then she stood and left as she ran after cars begging for alms. Kelvin sat in his lavish living room, the golden chandeliers above him casting a warm glow. But the light couldn't chase away the darkness in his heart. He poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling as the phone in his pocket buzzed again. It was yet another call. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Kelvin, I just saw your mother at the junction, begging for money," the voice said with a mix of pity and judgment. "Why are you letting her embarrass herself like this?" Kelvin hung up before the person could finish, his chest tightening with frustration and pain. Tears welled up in his eyes. He had everything, a mansion, cars, businesses worth billions. But his mother was begging in the streets, and now people were beginning to talk. The whispers started as murmurs in his circle, but quickly spread throughout the city. Rumors swirled that Kelvin had used his mother for rituals, that her begging was part of the price he had to pay for his wealth. The weight of the accusations crushed him. The rumors eventually reached Ngozi, Kelvin's wife. She had overheard women at her gym whispering about her husband. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ngozi broke her silence. "Kelvin," she began, setting her fork down, her tone measured but firm, "we need to talk about Mama." Kelvin looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion. "What about her?" Ngozi sighed. "People are saying things about you and why she's begging. They say you used her for—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Rituals." Kelvin froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The word hit him like a slap. "Rituals?" he repeated, his voice rising. "You think I'd do that to my own mother?" "I don't believe it," Ngozi quickly defended herself. "But Kelvin, why does Mama keep begging? You have enough money to feed 1,000 families, yet your mother is out there on the streets. People are talking, and it's getting hard to ignore." Kelvin slammed his fist on the table, his frustration boiling over. "You think I haven't tried? I've begged her to come home. I've offered her everything, but she refuses." "Then prove it," Ngozi shot back, her eyes brimming with tears. "Prove you're not hiding something. Bring her home and take care of her." Kelvin, feeling cornered, called his sisters, Amara and Grace, to a family meeting. When they arrived at his mansion, they found him pacing the living room like a caged animal. "We need to do something about Mama," Kelvin began, his voice heavy with desperation. "The rumors are getting out of hand. Ngozi is questioning me, people are calling me a ritualist, and I can't take it anymore." Amara, always the practical one, crossed her arms. "Kelvin, we've tried everything. She won't listen to us." Grace added, "Do you know how many times I've gone to her with gifts? She just sends me away." Kelvin ran a hand through his hair, his voice breaking. "Then what do we do? Let the whole city think I sacrificed my own mother for money?" The room fell silent until Amara spoke. "We have to bring her home, forcefully if we have to." Kelvin looked at her, startled. "You mean—" "Yes," Amara said firmly, "we'll hire some men to bring her here. She won't come willingly, so we'll have to make her." Grace hesitated. "Do you think that's the right thing to do? What if she never forgives us?" Kelvin's voice was barely a whisper. "I'd rather have her hate me than see her begging on the streets." The next day, Kelvin contacted a discreet security firm. He explained the situation, and they agreed to help. The plan was simple: locate Amaka at her usual begging spot, gently but firmly escort her to Kelvin's house, and ensure she was safe. Kelvin barely slept that night, his mind racing with what-ifs. What if his mother resisted? What if she hated him for this? But he knew he had no choice. The rumors were destroying his life and his family's reputation. Early the next morning, the men approached Amaka at the busy street corner where she begged. She was sitting on her usual spot, her tattered clothes hanging loosely on her frail frame. As one of the men approached, she looked up with suspicion. "What do you want?" she asked, clutching her tin can protectively. "Madam, please come with us," the man said gently. "Your son wants to see you." Amaka shook her head. "I've told him I'm fine here. I don't need his money." The men exchanged glances. They didn't want to use force, but Amaka wasn't making it easy. One of them knelt before her, speaking softly. "Ma, Kelvin is crying. He's worried about you. Please, just come with us." Amaka hesitated, her expression softening for a moment. But then she shook her head again. "None believe me." Realizing they had no other choice, the men gently lifted her to her feet. She struggled at first, shouting, "Leave me! Let me go!" But they carried her to the waiting car and drove to Kelvin's mansion. When the car pulled into the driveway, Kelvin was waiting outside, his heart pounding. As the men helped Amaka out, she glared at her son. "Why have you done this, Kelvin?" she demanded, her voice trembling with anger. "I told you to leave me where I am." Kelvin fell to his knees before her, tears streaming down his face. "Mama, please. I can't do this anymore. People think I've done something terrible to you. They say I've used you for rituals. I need you to stay here, with me, so they can see that it's not true." Amaka's expression softened as she saw the anguish in her son's eyes. She reached out and touched his face, her own eyes filling with tears. "Kelvin," she said softly, "I never meant to hurt you. But I can't stay here either. Please take me back, I beg of you." Kelvin had never been so frustrated in his life. Watching his mother, Amaka, cry and bang on the locked door tore at his heart, but he refused to let her leave. He had begged her to stay and live with him in comfort, but her stubbornness was testing his patience. His voice thundered through the house as he instructed the gatekeeper, "Don't let her leave this compound. If you do, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Amaka's cries echoed through the house. "Kelvin, my son, please, let me go. I don't belong here. You're inviting trouble upon yourself. Please, let me leave." But Kelvin hardened his heart. He was determined to save her from the humiliation of begging in the streets. Kelvin's wife, Ngozi, couldn't bear the sound of Amaka's cries. She went to the locked room where her mother-in-law was being held and opened the door slightly. "Mama, please calm down," Ngozi said gently. "Why won't you let us take care of you? You don't need to beg anymore." Amaka turned to her, tears streaming down her face. "Ngozi, I beg you, talk to Kelvin. Tell him to let me go. I made a vow to God, and every moment I stay here, I break that vow. This house is not my home." Ngozi stared at her, bewildered. She didn't know how to respond. Amaka's desperation felt deeper than she could understand, and it left her feeling helpless. The next morning, Kelvin was preparing to leave for work when his phone rang. He answered the call with a confident smile, expecting good news about his shipments. Instead, his face turned pale as the voice on the other end delivered the devastating news. "Sir, I'm so sorry to inform you, but the 5 containers being shipped to you have sunk in the ocean. Everything is gone." Kelvin staggered, dropping his phone. "No, this can't be happening," he shouted. Ngozi rushed to him from the bathroom, alarmed by his outburst. "What's wrong, Kelvin?" Kelvin, now in tears, recounted the call to her. "Those containers were worth hundreds of millions. They were everything. I don't understand what's happening to me." As Kelvin was speaking, Ngozi suddenly felt a sharp pain in her neck. She placed her hand on it and gasped when she felt a large lump. She ran to the mirror in disbelief. "What is this?" she whispered to herself, fear gripping her chest. She went to the hospital later that day and was told that the lump was real and unexplained. Shocked and confused, she began to wonder if something bigger was at play. While Kelvin grappled with his losses, tragedy struck Amara. 2 months into her pregnancy, she started experiencing sharp pains. She was rushed to the hospital only to hear the heartbreaking news that she had lost her baby. Grace, too, faced unexplained challenges in her business. A lucrative deal she had been working on for months suddenly fell apart without warning. Meanwhile, at Kelvin's house, Amaka refused to eat. Plates of jollof rice and chicken were brought to her, but she only stared at the food, tears streaming down her face. "This house is cursed for me," she whispered. "I can't eat here. Let me go, Kelvin, please." Kelvin's misfortunes kept piling up. The final straw came when he lost an 800 million naira deal that was supposed to be a game changer for his business. He came home that evening, his eyes red from crying. "I don't understand what's happening to me," he told Ngozi, his voice trembling. "Everything I've built is falling apart." Ngozi, who had been watching all this unfold, couldn't bear it anymore. She went to the room where Amaka was being kept and unlocked the door. "Mama," she said softly, "you can go. I won't stop you anymore." She turned to the gatekeeper and gave him firm instructions. "Open the gate and let her leave." Amaka stepped out of the room, her face a mix of relief and sadness. As soon as the gate opened, she fell to the ground outside, rolling in the dirt and crying uncontrollably. She began scooping sand into her hands, pouring it over her head as she wailed. "I thank you. I am free again. I will suffer so that my children will not suffer. I will drink dirty water so that my children can drink clean water. I will beg so that my children will never lack. Thank you, mothers, for letting me return to where I belong." Ngozi stood by the gate, frozen in shock, watching the scene unfold. Amaka got up, dusted herself off, and ran off down the street, begging passers-by for money as though nothing had happened. Ngozi felt it deep in her heart that something was wrong. Ngozi sat nervously in the doctor's office, her heart pounding. The lump on her neck had appeared out of nowhere, and the fear of what it could mean consumed her. The doctor entered the room, holding her test results in his hand. "Mrs. Ngozi," he began, his tone calm but serious, "let's take another look at that lump." She nodded, tilting her head as the doctor examined her neck. His brows furrowed, and he took a step back, confusion etched across his face. I can't find it," he stammered. "It's gone." Ngozi blinked, startled. "Gone? What do you mean it's gone?" The doctor checked again, running his fingers over the area where the lump had been. "There's nothing there. It's as if it was never there in the first place." Ngozi stared at him in disbelief. Relief washed over her, but a strange unease lingered. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, Kelvin sat in his office, reviewing documents, when his phone rang. It was a call from the company overseeing his lost contract. "Mr. Kelvin," the voice on the other end said, "we're happy to inform you that the contract has been reinstated. It's yours." Kelvin froze, gripping the phone tightly. "What? Are you serious? It was cancelled just 2 days ago." "Yes," the caller confirmed. "There was an error on our part. The contract is back on the table, and we'll be moving forward as planned." Kelvin leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. This contract was worth billions and had been a devastating loss. Now, out of nowhere, it was his again. That evening, Kelvin returned home, eager to share the good news with his wife. But before he could speak, Ngozi approached him cautiously, guilt evident in her eyes. "Kelvin," she began, her voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." Kelvin frowned. "What is it, Ngozi?" "I let Mama go," she confessed. "I unlocked the door and told the gatekeeper to let her leave." Kelvin's face hardened, his anger boiling over. "What? Why would you do that? After everything, you just let her go?" "Kelvin, listen to me," Ngozi pleaded. "Ever since Mama left, everything has been getting better. The lump on my neck disappeared. Your contract is back. Don't you see? Something is wrong. Keeping Mama here was a mistake." Amara and Grace, who had arrived earlier for a family dinner, overheard the argument and joined in. "You shouldn't have let her go, Ngozi," Amara said angrily. "She's our mother. We were trying to help her." But Grace, usually quiet, interjected. "Wait, Amara. Ngozi might have a point. Ever since Mama left, everything that went wrong is being reversed. Isn't that strange?" The room fell silent as Kelvin's phone rang again. He answered quickly, and the voice on the other end sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Kelvin," the caller from the seaport said, "we've recovered your containers, all 5 of them. They were intact and untouched. It's a miracle." Kelvin's phone slipped from his hand as he staggered back. His head spun as the pieces began to fit together. Meanwhile, Amaka sat in her small hut, deep in thought. The day had been long, and her heart felt heavy. Her friend, Mama Ebeli, visited and noticed the worry etched on her face. "Amaka, what is wrong?" Mama Ebeli asked, sitting beside her. Amaka sighed deeply, her voice trembling. "My children locked me up in their house. They thought they were helping me by forcing me to stay. But they don't understand. I've made vows they cannot comprehend." Mama Ebeli placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You need to tell them the truth, Amaka. They deserve to know why you are the way you are. My children know the sacrifices I made for them. It's time your children know yours." Amaka nodded, tears streaming down her face. "You're right. Things are getting out of control. They need to know. Tomorrow, I'll go to them and confess everything." Early the next morning, Amaka arrived at Kelvin's mansion. She sat outside the gate, her frail body hunched as she waited. When the gatekeeper saw her, he approached cautiously. "Mama, what are you doing here?" "Go inside and tell Kelvin, his wife, and his sisters to come out. I have something important to tell them," she said firmly. The gatekeeper hurried inside, and soon Kelvin, Ngozi, Amara, and Grace came to the gate. Kelvin's face was a mixture of confusion and frustration as he saw his mother sitting on the ground. The morning was heavy with tension as Kelvin, Ngozi, Amara, and Grace gathered outside the gate. Their mother, Amaka, sat on the ground, her frail hands folded in her lap, her face lined with sorrow and exhaustion. Kelvin was the first to speak, his voice tinged with frustration and confusion. "Mama, what is this all about? Why have you come here so early? What's going on? Why are you doing this? Atlas, let's go inside." Amaka looked at her children, her eyes filled with tears. "My children, I have come to tell you the truth. It is time you know everything. Sit down and listen to me." Reluctantly, they all sat down on the steps outside the gate, their curiosity mixed with dread. Amaka took a deep breath and began to speak. "You all know how we suffered," she started, her voice trembling. "When your father died, we had nothing. I watched you, my precious children, struggle every day. Kelvin, you hawked pure water in the scorching sun. Amara and Grace sold plantain chips, running from one end of the street to the other. We soaked Gary morning, afternoon and night, because we couldn't afford even the cheapest food." Her voice broke, and she wiped her tears with the edge of her shawl. "Kelvin, do you remember the day those boys falsely accused you of stealing? They tied you to a pole and were ready to set you ablaze. I ran to the scene, screaming and begging them to let you go. That day, I thought I would lose you." Kelvin clenched his fists, the memory flooding back like a dark shadow. He couldn't stop the tears that began streaming down his face. Amaka continued, "Every night I cried to God, asking why he had forsaken us. I begged for a miracle, for something, anything, that would save us from our misery. I felt like heaven had turned its back on us. One day," Amaka said, her voice growing quieter, "Mama Ebele came to me. She told me she knew of a place where our story could change. At first I was skeptical, but I was desperate. I agreed to go with her. She took me to a shrine, a place where a goddess ruled. The goddess listened to my cries and told me she could make my children wealthy beyond their wildest dreams." She paused, her voice trembling as she continued, "But there was a price. The goddess told me that I would have to sacrifice my life, not by dying, but by living a life of poverty and shame. She gave me money, the money I used to send Kelvin to the city to start his business. She told me that the wealth would flow to all my children, but I had to make a vow." Amaka's voice cracked as she spoke, her eyes darting between her children. "The goddess said that for you to remain wealthy, I must never share in your wealth. I must never live in your comfort or eat your food. Instead, I must beg on the streets for the rest of my life. That was the sacrifice." Ngozi gasped, covering her mouth in disbelief. Amara and Grace exchanged horrified glances while Kelvin sat frozen, his face pale. "She warned me," Amaka continued, "that if I ever broke the vow, if I ever accepted your money or lived in your houses, everything would crumble. Your wealth would vanish, and you would return to the life we once lived. I did this for you. I did it because I couldn't bear to see you suffer anymore." Amaka stood up slowly, her frail body shaking. "Now you know the truth. I didn't want to tell you, but things were getting out of control. I will go back to the streets where I belong so you can continue to enjoy the life I sacrificed everything for." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving her children in stunned silence. The air was thick with emotion, and no one could find the strength to move or speak. Kelvin broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Mama? She did all of this for us?" He buried his face in his hands and began to cry. His shoulders shook as years of unspoken pain and guilt poured out. Amara and Grace sat beside him, their own tears falling freely. "She suffered so much for us," Amara whispered, "and we locked her up. We treated her like she was the problem." Ngozi, who had been silent, suddenly swayed and collapsed. The shock had overwhelmed her, and she fainted. Kelvin and his sisters quickly carried her inside and laid her on the couch. When she came to, her eyes were filled with fear. "I can't stay here," Ngozi said, her voice trembling. "I can't spend another night in this house." Kelvin tried to calm her down. "Ngozi, please, we need to figure this out together. Don't leave." But she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Kelvin, your mother made a vow with forces I don't understand. This house, this life, it feels cursed. I need to leave." She went to the bedroom and began packing her bags. Kelvin followed her, pleading with her to stay, but she was resolute. That night, Kelvin sat alone in the living room, his head in his hands. His sisters had gone home, still reeling from the confession. His wife had left, taking a bag of clothes and vowing to stay with her family until she could process everything. Kelvin thought about his mother, about the sacrifices she had made, the life she had chosen to give him and his sisters a better future. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of her love and the burden she had carried alone for so many years. But he knew all wasn't well. Whatever she did need to be broken, Ngozi, his wife, had left the house without any. Not even a car or her jewelries, she said all of it were cursed. And until he decides to forfeit all this, she will never come back. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind raced. He couldn't reconcile the wealth he had amassed with the suffering his mother endured every day. It felt wrong, wicked even, to continue basking in riches built on such a dark and painful sacrifice. At the break of dawn, he made a decision. Kelvin dressed in simple clothes and left the mansion, driving to the rundown hut where his mother lived. When he arrived, the sight of the tattered structure broke him. He found his mother sitting on a wooden stool, her frail frame hunched over as she peeled cassava. After her children left, Amaka went back to the river where the goddess had given her the money. She stood by the water, her heart heavy, and called out to the deity. "My children no longer want the wealth you gave us," Amaka said, her voice trembling. "They say they'd rather be poor than see me suffer." The water rippled and the goddess appeared, her voice echoing like thunder. "If your children truly wish to break the vow, they must sell everything they own. Their houses, their cars, their businesses, everything must be sold. The money must be returned to me. They must bring it to this river and cast it into the waters." Amaka bowed her head. "I will tell them." Kelvin wasted no time. He sold his mansion, his luxury cars, his oil and gas business. Everything he had worked for, even the clothes in his wardrobe, were sold. Amara and Grace did the same, liquidating her boutique and clothing line. They carried the money in sacks and took a commercial motorcycle to the river. When they arrived, the air was thick with tension. They stood by the water, looking at the sacks of money that represented years of success and hard work. Kelvin took a deep breath and threw the first sack into the river. Amara followed, and soon all the money was gone, swallowed by the dark water. As they stood there, a strange calmness washed over them. The weight of the curse lifted from their shoulders, leaving them feeling free for the first time in years. Kelvin and Amara returned to the slum where their mother lived. With no money and no possessions, they rented a small room in the same neighborhood. Kelvin's wife, Ngozi, who had left him out of fear, returned when she heard what he had done. "I'm proud of you," she said, tears in her eyes. "This is the man I fell in love with." Together, they started rebuilding their lives. Kelvin and Ngozi found work at a local beer parlor, serving drinks to customers. Amara and her husband also found humble jobs, determined to make an honest living. One evening, Kelvin was serving drinks when he saw a familiar face walk into the beer parlor. It was his best friend, Tunde, who had known him since their days of struggle. Tunde froze when he saw Kelvin wearing an apron, carrying a tray of drinks. "Kelvin?" Tunde whispered, his voice shaky. Kelvin turned and smiled. "Tunde, long time." Tunde couldn't believe his eyes. The man who had once been a billionaire, living in luxury, was now serving drinks in a dingy bar. Tears rolled down Tunde's cheeks as he walked over and hugged his friend. "What happened, Kelvin?" Tunde asked, his voice breaking. "How did it come to this?" Kelvin sat across from his best friend, Tunde, in the dimly lit beer parlor. The clinking of bottles and murmurs of conversation around them were a distant hum as Kelvin poured out his story. By the time Kelvin finished, Tunde's face was a mixture of shock and admiration. "Kelvin," Tunde said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't believe all this. You gave up everything, your wealth, your status, just to honor your mother and do what's right. Not many people would have the courage to do that." Kelvin smiled faintly, his eyes tired but peaceful. "It wasn't easy, Tunde, but I couldn't let my mother suffer anymore." Tunde leaned forward, a determined look on his face. "Listen, Kelvin, I know life is hard right now, but there's an opportunity in my company. A multi-million naira oil contract. It's vacant, and I'm in a position to recommend someone for it. You have the experience, and I trust you completely. Let me help you." Kelvin's eyes widened in disbelief. "Tunde, are you serious? After everything, you still believe in me?" "Of course," Tunde said firmly. "You're one of the most hard-working and honest people I know. You deserve this chance." A meeting was scheduled. By the end of the meeting, the executives exchanged approving glances. One of them, a middle-aged man with a warm smile, extended his hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Kelvin," he said. "We're awarding you the contract. It's worth 85 million naira, and it includes a house and a car as part of the package." Kelvin was stunned. Tears welled up in his eyes as he shook the man's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you so much." When Kelvin returned home, he was greeted by his mother, his wife Ngozi, and his sisters, Amara and Grace. They noticed the excitement in his eyes as he stepped into their modest home. "What happened?" Ngozi asked, her heart racing. Kelvin smiled, tears streaming down his face. "God has done it," he said. "I got the contract, 85 million naira, a house and a car. Everything is changing." Kelvin's mother knelt on the floor, her hands raised to the heavens. "God's time is the best," she shouted repeatedly, her voice breaking with emotion. "God's time is the best." All the family celebrated. Even their mother, Amaka, allowed herself to enjoy the blessings she had once sacrificed. She moved into the mansion with them, living in comfort and joy for the first time in decades.